You don't notice the moment it starts. There's no dramatic collapse, no single bad decision you can point to later and say, that's where everything went wrong. It feels quieter than that. A paycheck comes in, the same way it always has. The bills get paid, the essentials are covered, nothing reckless, nothing excessive. And yet by the time the month ends, there's nothing left. Not because of one big expense, but because of everything at once, stacking just slightly higher than what you earn. It's subtle enough to ignore at first, until it isn't. And what makes this harder to understand is that on paper, nothing looks broken. Income is higher than it used to be. Employment cost burdened. Right now, millions of households fall into that second category. Not because they made extreme choices, but because the baseline cost of a stable life has moved beyond what a median income can support. And once that threshold is crossed, something important changes. The problem is no longer about managing money better. It becomes about surviving a system where the numbers don't quite add up anymore. There's also something else happening beneath the surface, something less visible but just as real. Research in behavioral economics shows that when people operate under constant financial constraint, their focus narrows, attention shifts toward immediate obligations, this month's rent, this week's groceries, and away from long-term planning. It's not a lack of discipline, it's a cognitive response to pressure. When your margin disappears, your thinking changes with it. That's why this doesn't feel like a single problem you can fix. It feels like a weight you carry without being able to fully explain it. And that feeling has a pattern. It shows up in the same way across different incomes, different cities, different lifestyles. The details change, but the outcome stays consistent. A life that looks stable from the outside, but is operating with almost no room for error underneath. And once you start following the numbers, rent, insurance, healthcare, childcare, you begin to see what's actually happening. Not a series of isolated price increases, but a system where every essential cost is rising at the same time, faster than income can realistically keep up. That's the story most people are living right now, even if they don't have the words for it yet. What makes this situation so difficult to recognize in real time is that, on the surface, everything still looks functional. The job title hasn't changed. From the outside, there's no visible sign of collapse, and that's exactly what creates the illusion. Because stability for most people has never been about how things look. It's about whether there's any space left after everything is paid. And for a growing number of households, that space has quietly vanished. There was a time when earning a middle-income salary came with a clear set of expectations. Yes, you could save, even if slowly. You could absorb a surprise expense without it turning into a financial emergency. That buffer, small but critical, was what separated stability from fragility. Today, that buffer is often the first thing to disappear. The shift didn't happen all at once, which is why it's so easy to miss. Costs didn't spike in a single category and force a clear adjustment. They rose gradually, across multiple categories at the same time. Housing climbed, then insurance, then utilities, then food. Each increase on its own felt manageable, something you could adjust around. But taken together, they changed the entire structure of the budget. What used to be flexible spending is now fixed. What used to be savings is now absorbed by recurring costs. And what used to feel stable now operates right at the edge. This is where the disconnect starts to take hold. Because when people feel financial pressure, the instinct is to look inward, to assume there's something they're doing wrong. Spending too much, saving too little, not optimizing enough. But that explanation starts to break down when the same experience shows up across millions of households who are all making different choices, living in different places, and earning different incomes. At that scale, it stops being about individual behavior and starts looking like a pattern. And the numbers behind that pattern are difficult to ignore. The median household income in the United States sits at just over $83,000 a year. On paper, that's a solid income. It represents the midpoint of the entire country. For decades, that level of earning was enough to support a version of the American baseline. Stable housing, reliable transportation, healthcare access, the ability to raise a family and still maintain some level of financial security. Not luxury, but stability. But the definition of stability has changed, even if the income number hasn't kept up in the same way. Because what matters isn't just how much money comes in, it's what that money actually has to cover. And over time, the cost of that baseline life has moved upward faster than income has. Not dramatically in one area, but consistently across all of them. When you adjust for what things actually cost today, that $83,000 doesn't stretch the way it used to. It gets absorbed more quickly, leaving less room for everything else. And when that margin disappears, something fundamental shifts in how a household operates. You're no longer allocating money based on priorities or goals. You're reacting to obligations. The decisions aren't about what's best, they're about what's due. That distinction matters more than it seems. Because once a budget becomes obligation-driven instead of choice-driven, the ability to move forward financially starts to stall. Saving becomes inconsistent. Investing gets delayed. Even small risks, like changing jobs or moving to a new city, start to feel too dangerous to take. Not because the opportunity isn't there, but because there's no cushion to absorb what might go wrong. And that's the part most people don't see. From the outside, it still looks like a functioning system. People are working, earning, paying their bills. But underneath, the structure has changed. Once the gap becomes a permanent feature of the budget, the way people make decisions starts to shift in ways that can look irrational from the outside, but feel completely logical from the inside. This is where the conversation around good and bad financial choices begins to break down. Because those categories assume that people are operating with options. In reality, many households are choosing between constraints. When income consistently falls short of fixed obligations, the goal isn't optimization anymore. It's continuity. Keeping the lights on, keeping the rent paid, keeping life moving forward without interruption. And in that environment, the timeline of decision-making collapses. Long-term costs matter less than immediate survival, because the immediate consequences are the ones that can't be avoided. This is where high-cost financial tools enter the picture, not as a preference, but as a bridge. Credit cards with high interest rates, payday loans with annualized rates that can exceed 300%, buy now, pay later plans that split payments into smaller pieces without reducing the total cost. These are often framed as traps, and they can be, but they also serve a function in a system where cash flow doesn't line up with required expenses. If the rent is due today and the account is short, the choice isn't between a low-interest option and a high-interest one. It's between paying and not paying, between maintaining stability and triggering a cascade of late fees, penalties, or even eviction risk. In that context, the expensive option becomes the least damaging one available in that moment. The problem is what happens next. Because these tools don't eliminate the gap, they shift it forward. The bill still exists, but now it's larger. Interest adds weight. Minimum payments create new fixed obligations, and the next month starts under slightly more pressure than the last one did. By the time financial pressure reaches this stage, the effects are no longer contained to numbers on a spreadsheet. They start showing up in how people think, how they plan, and how they move through everyday decisions. And this is the part that almost never gets discussed in traditional economic coverage, even though it may shape outcomes more than any single expense category. Behavioral economics has studied this pattern for years. When people operate under consistent scarcity, whether it's time, money, or resources, their attention narrows. Focus shifts toward immediate demands and away from long-term. The present has become too urgent to ignore. When the rent is due, when the account balance is tight, when the next bill is already accounted for before the paycheck arrives, the future becomes something you plan around later, if there's space left to do it. This isn't a personality trait, it's a cognitive response. In practical terms, it changes the way decisions are made. Opportunities that involve short-term risk, changing jobs, starting a business, going back to school, start to feel inaccessible, even if they offer long-term benefits. Not because the person doesn't recognize the upside, but because the downside carries immediate consequences that the current system can't absorb. A temporary dip in income, a few months without stability, a delayed paycheck. Any of those could trigger a chain reaction in a budget that has no margin. So the rational choice becomes staying put. At a distance, it's easy to believe that financial instability arrives as a single dramatic event. A job loss, a medical emergency, a sudden crisis that forces everything to unravel at once. But when you follow the numbers closely, that's rarely how it actually happens. What we've been tracing isn't a moment, it's a buildup. A system where income remains relatively stable while the cost of maintaining a basic functional life rises across every essential category at the same time. Housing takes more than it used to, utilities into a second layer of fixed costs. Healthcare adds a standing financial risk, whether it's used or not. Childcare, for many, restructures the value of working itself. And month after month, the gap between what comes in and what needs to go out, even when it's small, starts to accumulate. By the time something goes wrong, the system is already under pressure. That's why the stories that surface, evictions, missed payments, rising debt, even homelessness, can feel sudden from the outside, but rarely are. In many cases, they're the visible endpoint of a process that's been building quietly for a long time. A rent increase that couldn't be absorbed, a medical bill that arrived at the wrong moment, a job interruption that lasted just long enough to disrupt everything else. Not extreme events, but ordinary ones landing in a financial structure that no longer has the capacity to absorb them. And that's the part that changes how this entire issue should be understood. Because when large numbers of people who are working, earning, and meeting their responsibilities are still operating without margin, the outcome stops being about individual decisions. It becomes a reflection of how the system itself is structured. A system where stability depends not just on what you earn, but on whether the total cost of participating in everyday life stays within reach of that income. Right now, for many households, it doesn't. The expectation that steady work leads to steady progress, that over time effort translates into security is still deeply embedded in how people think about their financial lives. But when the underlying math shifts, that expectation becomes harder to fulfill, no matter how carefully someone manages their money. And that's why this doesn't feel like bad luck when you experience it. It feels consistent, predictable even. The same pressure showing up month after month in slightly different forms, but always pointing to the same imbalance. The paycheck comes in, the obligations go out, and the space in between never quite holds. That's the condition more people are living in now. Not financial collapse, not complete instability, but something more subtle and, in many ways, more difficult to address. A system that continues to function, but without the margin that makes it resilient. And when that margin disappears, the distance between being stable and falling behind isn't measured in years. It's measured in a single event. One bill, one disruption, one moment where the numbers don't align. That's all it takes. And once you see the pattern, it becomes clear that this isn't just happening in isolated cases. It's happening at scale, which raises a question that goes beyond any single household, any single budget, or any single decision. If doing everything right no longer guarantees stability, then what, exactly, is the system designed to deliver? And more importantly, how long can it keep working like this before something gives?